The bomb never reached its target. The terrorist who carried it actually tripped and fell over 50 feet away, setting it off when he hit the ground and killing him half an hour later. Only a single brick of his intended target was scratched by a piece of shrapnel, a brick which belonged to the Greenwich Observatory in England. His bomb wasn't meant for the observatory itself, but rather its clock, which at the time was the most important clock on Earth. And he wasn't the only one to try to bomb it. In fact, ever since the introduction of clocks, people actively destroyed or at least fought against them across the globe, at least until everyone fell in line. Today, we tell a tale as old as time, because, well, it's the story of time itself. I want you to try to imagine a world without time. Honestly, you can't. We are so conditioned to operating in terms of hours, seconds, months, that the simple idea of a life that isn't dictated by these imaginary measurements seems like, well, almost an impossibility, a distant dream. But this is how humans lived and operated for most of human history, at least until the Mesopotamians divided the year into 12 segments based on lunar patterns. Suddenly, the concept of a month was spawned from thin air, and not too long after, 3500 BCE, time could be measured when the Egyptians and the Babylonians came up with the first timekeeping device, the water clock. Then a few thousand years later, the sundial. Soon these devices sprouted up all across the Middle East, but it wasn't until one of them ended up in the possession of the Roman Empire that we for the first time witnessed criticism for this temporal revolution. A war hero, Manius Valerius Maximus, had just returned home from his campaign in Catania, a region in southern Italy. With him, he brought many spoils of war for the Roman people to enjoy, among them a few plundered sundials that were to be installed across the city as a display of their military might, the most extravagant of which was to be placed in the center of the forum itself to loom over the citizens of Rome. At the moment, few really realized the magnitude of what had just happened, but soon they learned, since the second these clocks were introduced to the Roman people, their entire order and how they went about their daily lives was shifted to accommodate this brand new concept of time. Suddenly they could be told when to sleep, when to wake up, when to work, when to eat, and there was fear now that every moment of their lives could eventually be decided by those in power. After a few years, the unease triggered by this change leaked into the writings of critics and playwrights, who started to openly criticize the new installations across the city. One citizen wrote, "The gods damn the man who first discovered the hours, and yes, who first set up a sundial here, who smashed the day into bits for poor me." Later on, another writer would call the sundial in the forum quote-unquote hateful and call for it to be torn down, only for an even more accurate one to take its place a century later, and just 5 years after that, a water clock was mounted next to it, meaning they could now track the time during the night. But even if the people wanted to fight back and destroy these clocks, the ruling elite now had another tool in their arsenal to protect their power. With the aid of time, they could now set a curfew, a tool which has and will continue to be used to quell public unrest for the rest of human history. All of the clocks that existed up to this point were useful, but not very practical. A rogue cloud could make a sundial dysfunctional, and the same with any lunar clock. And water clocks constantly jammed up and needed maintenance. People needed a clock that was precise for long periods of time and could rely on none other than itself. The solution would be defined by an intricate collection of gears and springs. The mechanical clock was born. Between the time of its invention in 1275 and the year of 1600, nearly 200 towns and cities across Europe had been fitted with a public mechanical clock. Just for perspective, your bedroom likely has more clocks in it than a medieval kingdom. But people soon realized that they didn't necessarily need to be these massive structures for thousands of people to see. So some clockmakers started to look into if they could compact the mechanisms down to something small enough to be portable. Small clocks, which could be set down in a home, workplace, or any site deemed suitable, would start to enter our daily lives in the 15th century, and watches, portable timekeepers that we keep on our person, started to appear in the 16th century. Time could now follow us anywhere, at least if you had enough money to afford that expensive luxury. And with clocks constantly in view, people started to buy into a wholly new concept, one that we are all too familiar with today, that time can be wasted. For the first time ever, societies were started to equate personal timeliness with moral righteousness. The race for efficiency had begun. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which opened its doors in 1611, was the birthplace of modern capitalism. And it was no accident that it was fitted with a massive clock. Time was essential to the function of exchanges, as it was crucial to keep track of who bought what at what time. Additionally, there were time constraints placed on trading hours so that everyone showed up to the exchange around the same time, which increased trading volume as a whole. In fact, clocks were so essential to the story of stock exchanges that it's hard to find a painting or photograph of any exchange from back then that doesn't prominently feature one. These were so extravagant that before the Big Ben was built, the London Stock Exchange held England's most famous clock. And speaking of England, at this point in time, they were the kings of clockmaking. Yeah, that might surprise you today, but back then they made the best clocks in the world and everyone knew it. In fact, it was seen as heresy to import foreign-made clocks. Watchmakers who did so were targeted in the industry. English culture at the time was cited on spreading their native-made clocks all across the world. A world which they pretty much controlled. They forced their concept of time onto their colonies, partially for economic reasons, but they also raised these clock towers to instill the British presence of order into their ruled territories, each fitted with loud bells that rang out on the hour. Every colonial power did this in their colonies and for obvious reasons, but the British by far enveloped the most people in the concept of time. In India, for example, they erected a clock tower in nearly every major town in the country. And as the Industrial Revolution started to sweep across England, they were able to create even better means of controlling these colonies with their new technological innovations. But it had an unexpected effect on their clockmaking industry. The Industrial Revolution was defined by machines, which are composed of many moving parts, some small and some big. And at that point in time, the only class of people that had experience with making things consisting of moving parts were clockmakers. One by one, the best and most talented of them were bought out by corporations to help them create these machines, and within a few decades, England's clockmaking industry was stripped clean. And this opened the door to competition. By 1870, Switzerland was producing 2/3 of the world's watches by value. They were dominating the watch industry. But when it came to clocks, not just watches, America was taking over. And that's because throughout the 1800s, a system of mass production was being developed. Instead of making clocks on demand, they were instead made in bulk by using machines and standardizing parts, and then sold after the fact. This was the first time this was attempted in any industry whatsoever, and was the inspiration for Henry Ford's assembly line, who himself started out working as a clockmaker. Soon, they were able to streamline the process until clocks, for the first time in all of human history, were affordable for everyday people. By 1837, one of these American-made clocks cost just $1.40, the equivalent of around $45.50 today. That is dirt cheap in the context of history. And by 1870, they started to be fitted with alarms, and from then on, the very first thing people would encounter in their day-to-day lives would be a clock. Once these cheap creations made it onto the foreign market, the British, who were too stuck up to adapt their own clockmaking industry, which ruled supreme for centuries, was crushed by the very industrial revolution that they themselves created. Now, while all of this was happening, in the mid-1800s, Britain was having serious problems with deciding how to manage time within its own borders. As of then, and going back to the introduction of clocks, each town kept their own time based on the sun, meaning that one town could be as little as 5 to 10 minutes behind of another if it was just a few miles away, and this was common practice across the globe. but the system was starting to run into some issues from multiple angles. The invention of trains allowed people to traverse long distances in very short periods of time. There was no issue traveling from north to south because time didn't change, but for east to west, it was a completely different story. Passengers would need to adjust their watches at every single station along their ride in order to keep track of the local time, and that's a nightmare. There was also an issue of workers being cheated out of time. In 1844, laws had been passed that only allow a certain number of hours to be worked, but the owners purposely slowed the clocks they had on site so that they could illegally squeeze more time and labor out of their employees, who were themselves forbidden from bringing their own watches on the premises. But there was a solution, and that was that the government decided to use a new technology, the telegraph, to send out time pulses from the Greenwich Observatory and to standardize all of England onto one unified time zone, Greenwich time. A single clock in the observatory would dictate any and all clocks in all of England, and everyone just happily fell in line. Just kidding, because this law was, in part, about control. You see, in Victorian-era society, there was a massive push for alcohol reform to restrict consumption to a certain time frame. But which time frame? If you were to do it by local time, it would be nearly impossible to enforce because the time in every town would be different. A crucial 1858 court case ruled that official time for Britain's courts was local, not Greenwich. So it was settled, right? According to the courts, local time was now the legal standard, but you'd be wrong. Despite this, the pressure from alcohol reformers was so great that in 1880, the royal court passed a bill that standardized Greenwich time, and the alcohol laws went into effect almost immediately after. For many, this law wasn't about locomotives or workers' rights. It was about control and imposing Victorian-era morality by restricting citizens' freedoms, and it was a hell of a lot easier to do with the time standard in place. And if it worked so well at home, why not do it elsewhere? So within a year after its implementation, Greenwich time was decided not to just be limited to determining every clock in England. Instead, it would be the standard, ideally, for every single clock in the entire world. In what can best be described as temporal colonialism, they attempted to force the standard upon all of their colonies and trading partners. But this did not go over well everywhere, especially in British India, where, due to resistance, the first attempt failed. So whenever things got tense due to other reasons in the following years, clock towers found themselves as symbolic targets. In the city of Bombay in 1898, Indian protesters opened fire with rifles on the local British clock tower, partially destroying one of its dials. 7 years later, in 1905, the argument re-emerged as the British attempted to force all of India under a single time zone that was 5.5 hours ahead of Greenwich. Many clocks across the country kept their local time and became symbols of colonial resistance. That same year, a protest of 15,000 broke out against the time standard. At one point, the largest textile mill in the city changed its time to Greenwich, and when workers arrived and saw this, they all went on strike and pelted the mill with rocks. But eventually, India fell and adopted the English time standard, making the clock in Greenwich by far the most important clock on Earth, and that made it a target. In 1894, a self-proclaimed anarchist attempted to bomb the observatory clock, but failed when he tripped and set off the bomb himself. For obvious reasons, the standardization of time conflicted with the beliefs of anarchists. But there was another bombing. This time in 1913. It went off within the observatory itself, and the notes left behind gave away what group did it. Suffragettes. Feminists fighting for their rights. For context, the early suffrage movement was explicitly anti-violence, by the way. But nothing was getting done, and by 1910, in Britain, it completely flipped on its head. Suffragettes would commonly commit arson attacks, cut telephone lines, and apparently bomb public spaces. These feminists were hardcore, but why a clock? Since clocks, and specifically the time standard, were seen as a means to establish power over people, and power at the time belonged exclusively to men, targeting a clock to cause chaos was seen as a very fitting way to get their attention to the cause. And this strategy eventually worked and they got what they wanted. But this isn't the only place where clocks crossed paths with bombs. In the age of industrialization, war itself was changing dramatically. New prototype weapons and technologies were being made each and every year. Militaries worldwide were scrambling to adapt, but one thing in particular would become essential to their arsenal. You guessed it, time. One thing that has always won wars was precision and timing, and now it was actually possible to accurately measure and coordinate movements rather than just going on a whim. Specifically, by being able to outfit soldiers on the ground with clocks. The result was that they quickly became as much of a military weapon as a bomb or a rifle, but pocket watches, the fashion of the time, were not practical for this use. Instead, militaries quickly adopted the wristwatch, which is why they're popular today. One of their first major uses was coordinating attacks with artillery or other units, something seen as almost impossible before. In fact, militaries loved time so much that they were willing to bend its rules if it gave them more efficiency. Daylight savings time, a radical concept first proposed by a random British farmer in 1906, was not taken seriously at the time whatsoever. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. You turn an imaginary number back an hour and then suddenly forward an hour. It was a decade later on the battlefield, in 1916, when the German military actually gave it a shot, since it would allow them to maximize more hours during the daytime. After the war, and over the next half-century or so, daylight savings would capture a large chunk of the world in peacetime, and the globalizing impacts of the Second World War finally structured the entire world around a standardized time, of course, by the Greenwich Standard. After taking off from Anchorage, Alaska, this flight was en route to its destination of Seoul, South Korea. But there was an issue. Their navigation technology was broken, and they were unknowingly flying over restricted Soviet airspace. A Russian jet was scrambled and given orders. The pilot tried to argue, but to no avail. A missile was launched, killing 269 passengers on board. And the real tragedy is that this all could have been completely avoided. For decades, the US military had been developing a brand new technology, primarily for allowing ships and submarines to find their exact locations so that they could accurately launch ballistic missiles. The thing is, this tech would require a wholly new kind of clock, an atomic one, which can give time precision to a degree seen as unimaginable before. And not only that, but this clock would need to be able to withstand violent movements, radiation, temperature fluctuations, and gravity fluctuations, because it was going to space in the form of a satellite. When the program was first conceived in the 1950s, it was a hard sell. Many military leaders couldn't see the point of this new technology and thought it was a waste of time. Nonetheless, they went forward with the program. And by the time Korean Flight 007 was shot down, they already had a few satellites in space and the technology was functioning, but classified to the public. However, just a week after the plane was shot down, the top secret program was revealed, and this new technology, called GPS, was made available for airlines to use. It would allow them to track their locations wherever they were by using transmitters that sent signals to various satellites in orbit, and today, hundreds of these atomic clocks float above our heads to help us navigate our day-to-day lives. And out of any clocks in human history, these have by far interacted with the most people. Though honestly, our reliance on them is quite dangerous. If something were to wipe them out or mess with the clocks inside of them, such as a solar flare or a hacking incident, millions if not billions of people would die because society would cease to function. Our lives are literally in the hands of these clocks, which is pretty damn scary to think about. But the accuracy of them is honestly astonishing. The best we have today can be accurate for up to plus or minus a single second for 30 billion years. That is more than twice the age of the universe, and these clocks will just continue to get more exponentially accurate as technology improves. And this raises a really interesting point. Clocks' ability to tell time for so long does give them a kind of symbolism. That being, making us consciously aware of a future beyond us. It forces us to think forward and not to be so narrow-minded about the present, and a number of projects have really attempted to capture that exact feeling. The most prominent of which is a 10,000-year clock. Located in a mountain in West Texas, its slowest moving part, the cuckoo bird, only comes out once every millennia, and one of its hands only advances every 100 years. Most of us watching will get to see neither of these movements. And that's the entire point. Because, after all, if a clock can keep going for 10 millennia, shouldn't we make sure our civilization does as well? Now, I hope that you're able to see in this video that I'm not trying to argue that clocks are inherently bad. They give incredible benefits with the order and structure that they provide us in our lives, but there most definitely has been a tension throughout all of history between freedom and that order, and that's what I want to really highlight in this video, which sincerely I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.